Welcome, everyone, and thank you for sticking it out. Not just taking a coffee break. We appreciate your being here for this important subject. Thank you, Your Excellency, for having us. It's a real privilege, and I want to say that as someone who covers art and culture in New York, to realize that this has become an essential destination is very exciting. It's not a place that was at the top of my list automatically, and now I see it's important to be here and see the work you're doing. That there really is sort of cutting-edge contemporary art happening here, and that's exciting for the world. I want to start, this is a subject that seems to have kind of woven in and out of our conversations so far on this conference. I have with me Martin Roth, the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and Professor Peter Stone, who is UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property, Protection and Peace, Newcastle University, and International Committee of the Blue Shield. And I think we should actually get to the Blue Shield, because I'm sure a lot of us don't even know what that is exactly. But just to kind of set the scene here, we have the destruction of heritage as a weapon of war in places like Palmyra has created a sense of kind of world emergency around this issue. Since 2011, 5 of 6 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Syria have been damaged. We are talking about shrines, statues, mosques, tombs, and churches. Secretary of State John Kerry of the US recently said at the Met Museum, our heritage is literally in peril. So I guess to just start with you, Peter, what are we doing about this, and have we made any progress?
Thank you. We've made a little progress, but we have got an awful long way to go. Culture and cultural property is always a victim of war. But it's interesting that for the last 2,500 years, military theorists have been saying that it shouldn't be. That if you destroy cultural property as a victor, what you are doing is giving the victim the first excuse for the next conflict. And if you continue to do that, then that's not a good thing. Most, as we all know, militaries have ignored that good advice over the last 2,500 years. But I got involved in this in 2003 when the main role was trying actually to get the then coalition that invaded Iraq to take the protection of cultural property seriously. And they failed dismally to do that. It was an appalling neglect of responsibility, and 99% of the damage that was done in Iraq to cultural property was either done by the coalition or enabled by the coalition because of their lack of proactive activity. And that's an appalling statement to be able to make. And what we should be doing, what I've been trying to do over the last decade or more now, is get the Western military, but actually all militaries, to begin to take the protection of cultural property during conflict seriously. And we do that with this organization, the Blue Shield, which actually the Blue Shield is the emblem identified in the 1954 Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, created after the Second World War. It was
1954?
1954. It was created as an organization in 1996 in anticipation of the second protocol to that 1954 convention. It's an organization which is constantly referred to in international law as the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross. And I always say it is absolutely, categorically, exactly the same as the Red Cross, apart from 3 minor differences. The first one, the Red Cross has been around for nearly 150 years. Everybody on the planet has heard of either the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. Nobody on the planet, or very few, now about another 150 people, have heard of the Blue Shield. Second minor difference, the Red Cross has a multi-million-pound annual budget. The Blue Shield has no annual budget at all. If, by the way, any of you know of somebody who has the odd 12 million to endow an organization, please see me afterwards. And then the third element of minor difference is that, of course, the Red Cross therefore has 12,000 paid professional staff working in 80-plus countries. The Blue Shield is a network of the committed, willing volunteer. So apart from those 3 minor differences, the 2 organizations are completely synonymous. But what we try to do is mitigate the damage done during conflict, by conflict, on cultural property. People say, but cultural property gets destroyed. Yes, it does. But if you actually pick down and look at why it does, there are at least 7 different reasons for why cultural property is destroyed. And if you begin to address each of those 7 by taking 20% of their impact down, you begin to make, or potentially make, a really big impact. So very briefly, I won't go into the detail, but the 7 are just lack of planning, spoils of war, military lack of awareness, collateral damage, looting, enforced neglect. You can't look after places during conflict. And then finally, but only finally, the specific targeting that we're seeing most recently from Daesh, but which has happened through the 20th century in various stages. And again, we haven't got time to go into the detail. The image that you see on the screen is just one example of this. This is a satellite photograph taken in 2011 of Apamea, a Roman city in Syria. And you can see going sort of vertically to the left of the image an excavated road and some excavated shops. On the right-hand side, those of you with the eye of faith can see horizontal lines going across, which are the below sand roads of the Roman city and streets of the Roman city. 8 months later, the same satellite went over, and that is what Apamea looked like. Each one of those is a looter's hole. We have no idea what came out of those looter's holes. We won't know until those objects are donated or sold or passed on to museums at some point in the next 50, 100 years. And that is an astonishing loss to the understanding of our common cultural heritage. It's happening clearly in Syria, but actually it's happening across the planet, and it's an issue that is focused at the moment on the MENA region, but is a detrimental issues going on everywhere else. Just one other example in the next slide. Here we are in Timbuktu, and 2 of the archivists, after Timbuktu had been freed by French forces in 2012, sifting through some of the burnt archival material of one of the archives in Timbuktu. Ask these guys if protecting cultural property is important, and I think you'll get a very forceful response.
But I think what's particularly counterintuitive about what you say is that we have a lot of emphasis on blaming Daesh and ISIS, when in fact these Western countries are complicit in some way. And we have our own sense of responsibility that to some extent we have fallen down on the job.
Absolutely. In 2003, I became, by the most stupid of reasons, simply because I was known by somebody in the Ministry of Defence, I became the only archaeologist to whom the Ministry of Defence would talk before the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, that was because I was eminently well qualified by knowing nothing about the archaeology of Iraq and knowing nothing about the archaeology of the region, effectively. But because I was known by a person who was asked the question on the last Wednesday of January of 2003, about 5 weeks before the the coalition invaded, he was asked by one of his staff at a tea break, "Gov, isn't there some archaeology in Iraq that we should be thinking about?" And that unit, to make it even worse, was the targeting unit of the Ministry of Defence. So the European, North American, and many other military organizations, emergency organizations, others, simply didn't connect, as they had done in the to an extent in the First and Second World Wars, that the protection of cultural property was important. Just one example from the First World War, when Allenby's column, the British column, depending on which way you look at it, liberated, occupied Jerusalem in 1917, the first thing that the British staff did was put troops to protect major monuments in the city and major religious buildings. And there's a photograph, which I could show people if they're interested, of one of the main mosques in Jerusalem being protected by British troops. But the really clever thing, and the thing that shows that somebody on the British staff, on Allenby's staff, was thinking at the time, is that that mosque is being protected not by British regulars from Britain, but by Muslim troops of the British Indian Army. And there was a coherence and a thought process going on there, which we simply have lost. So in 2003, or 2002, there were 6 different, for a better term, think tanks set up in Washington to plan for post-Saddam Iraq. Not one of them had culture, or let alone cultural heritage or cultural property, on their agenda. It was no, therefore, surprise that so much damage was done by coalition troops to the cultural heritage of Iraq. Helicopters being told, yeah, go and land over there. If you land over there, it doesn't actually create as much sandstorm, and it's much easier and quicker. Of course, over there was the formal courtyard of the World Heritage Site in the ancient Sumerian city of Babylon. And every time a Chinook took off or landed on that, they compacted and destroyed the archaeology underneath. They compacted and destroyed the millennia-old paving.
Martin, let's get Martin in here. How are you dealing with this as a museum director, and what do you see as the role of cultural institutions in fighting this?
I mean, just to say a few words. First of all, thank you for having us. I think it's such an important topic in that context. And being responsible for major collection in my job right now in London, but also before, you have to think about the context of that collection. And provenance research and the social dimension is part of it. And then, I mean, just to say it in the beginning, I'm always worried about a kind of agony in saying we can't do something against it because it's happening anyhow. So that's absolutely the wrong approach. We have to think about something. And what I mean is there has to be a strategy. And I'm always worried if there's a strategy that just thinks about the final solution and the destination is very far from here. We need something that we can do tomorrow. And tomorrow means that museums have to work together, that we need more intelligence. We just don't talk to each other. I mean, it's what you said about military. But it's also in the cultural world, in the art world. So just if the major museums would have more joint forces, it would help a lot.
That doesn't exist at this point?
It doesn't. I mean, we just work on that right now, and I think there's a kind of progress, but it's very slowly. So I'm not negative. It doesn't mean that I'm too pessimistic, but it takes a lot of time, and I think we need more support from the museum side. That's one part. The other thing, don't forget, it's part of our own history. Iconoclasm is part of our own history. I used to work in Saxony for a very long time, and Saxony is where Reformation started. And if you think about the iconoclasm of Reformation of Martin Luther, and what happened after that is just incredible. I'm now working in the V&A with still shrapnel impacts on the facade from the Blitz. And my horror is when we have construction site that it says in the headline in the newspaper, German director finds German bomb. But it's still somehow, there's still somehow this kind of historical context. And before that I was the director general of the museums in Dresden. So I know quite a lot about reconstruction of cities after, or museums after the damage. So what I mean, let's think about our own history before we, and our own experience before we talk about others. And finally, what you see in museums, the objects in museums are quite often part of destruction. So that's the other contradiction that we have in the museum, and especially in archaeological museums. So I think we can use those artifacts just to think more about the future. And I mean, I will say something a little bit later about replica, because suddenly, no, I'll say it later.
You can say it. Go ahead.
Now? There's a strange rebirth of replica suddenly. And it's really difficult for me to cope with it. I say it in a very personal way. Because, I mean, Jeff, what you said had something, this kind of the Nietzsche context and whatever, is that, I mean, for me as someone who grew up with the idea of Walter Benjamin, and there's the original object and the aura of the original, we suddenly cope with the idea that you can make a copy out of everything. Just a few months ago, that two artists went into the Neues Museum in Berlin and made a copy of Nefertiti with, more or less with the iPhone. It's easy today. So you can make, with 3D printing and a digital technology, you can make replicas.
What are the implications of that?
Yeah, but I think that, in the V&A, if you are familiar with the V&A, if not even more, come to the cast courts in the V&A and you see the major objects collected as copies in mid-19th century. The idea was at that time because people couldn't travel to the objects, so let the objects travel to the people. Today we have a lot of researchers, conservation people coming to the V&A and making copies of the copy because the original is destroyed by war impact, by environmental issues or more. So the question is, do we have to work with more copies? Coming back to military, what Peter said, military knowledge, it's easier today to make documentaries before things are destroyed. It's a cynical way of thinking about it, and that's my problem. There's a kind of cynical brutality, but at the same time, if we don't have documentaries or documentations, it will be more difficult in the end to reconstruct it. I don't say use satellite images and then we do 3D printing of temples. That's not what I mean, but we need more material. And I think, Peter, we are pretty much on the same page.
Yeah.
You had talked a little bit with me, Martin, about this idea that the museums themselves
are part of that.
They come out of this tradition, they have a lot of stuff that's sort of ill-gotten gains. How to reckon with that? Our own sort of responsibility for things that, we shouldn't have, but we do. How much emphasis should there be on returning, on restoration?
One part of it is just creating awareness, but I think that's probably what I would have said 5 years ago, but today awareness is not enough. But we can at least use those objects to think about new methods and technologies, and if you plan to come to the Venice Architectural Biennale, you will see a cooperation of the Biennale and the V&A on exactly showing those objects and replicas and discuss what it means for educational purpose, but also to create awareness and documentation. But honestly, there's not enough done. And again, it needs more cooperation between the major collections around the world.
There's also this angle of getting at it from the market point of view. There's a big market for this stuff and a real demand. To what extent, Peter, are you guys dealing with this, and should we be putting more of our emphasis on that end of the problem?
It's a very difficult problem to deal with. What you're talking about is the looting, as we've just seen, of major archaeological sites across what are referred to as source countries. And those source countries are obviously where the material comes from. Really where the issue is the market country and collectors who buy antiquities who are now at one level, if they're not consciously, they should be consciously understanding that what they may well be doing is contributing to Daesh's war chest. And an awful lot of material that is sold both on the licit and illicit antiquities markets have very dubious provenances. And we must be really careful about where that material comes from and when it was excavated or when it was looted and what we do about it. And it's a very difficult thing. Some colleagues relate it to the ivory trade, but there are all sorts of complications around it. Just one example of that, in 2003, towards the end of that year, I tried to get the British government to buy the produce produced by farmers in southern Iraq in the British area of responsibility. Because what had happened is the coalition had gone in and had dismantled the state. And the only market to whom those farmers could sell their produce was the state. So there was no longer a market, but those farmers still needed an income to buy everything else to maintain their families. So if the British had bought that produce and they could have left it rotting on the side of the road, they would have actually stopped possibly, I don't know, 60, 70 more % of the looting, of that immediate looting, because the only other source of income those southern Iraqi farmers had was to cull the ground for a different crop.
But Peter, isn't it the case that we don't know enough? I mean, the problem is that, again, we need more information about it. And I mean, I'm always a bit worried if you blame the art market, because there's something like there's a black art market and a grey art market and a white art market. I mean, we had a conference with the Yale University. By the way, there's another conference with the Yale University in the US beginning of April for those who want to do or want to be more engaged. And the art market is definitely part of that cooperation.
Absolutely.
You know, and I mean, talking to colleagues in Syria, what they tell us is that do your homework. I will never forget that when somebody said on Skype, do your homework. And the homework is talk to the art market and make the art market part of your strategy.
Oh,
Right.
absolutely. I mean, it's not a us and them, goody baddie situation. We have to have that communication, that dialogue, that working together. But we do have to accept the fact that there is an illicit trade in antiquities. I mean,
But if somebody came to me with an illicit antiquity and I don't buy it, what's going to happen to it? In other words, I think that you might have that moment of at least I'm saving it.
Yeah.
You know, from who knows what.
Well, again, that's where you come back to the parallel that some colleagues make with the ivory trade. What you do is you burn it. Is their reaction to that? Is what they do with ivory. When I was trying to focus the mind of the military again in the mid-2000s and get the unsuspecting military buying antiquities from the market as souvenirs, and we were trying to get the military to check everybody's bags on the way back, and they said, "Yeah, we do that already." They said, "You know, we always find 16 Kalashnikovs every regiment that people are trying to smuggle home and other sorts of things." And I said, "No, we're looking for things that are relatively smaller than that." And they said, "Well, give me an example." So I said, "Well, a Sumerian cylinder seal, maybe no bigger than my little pinky, my little finger, and that has tremendous value from an archaeological, from an art history point of view, from a documentary point of view, perhaps from studying and understanding the past." The military mindset was immediately, well, how much is that valuable for? Well, I was able to tell them that a week before, one had been sold in one of the major markets in New York for 100,000 US. And that would probably be significantly more on the illicit market. That began to focus the mind, and I can still see quite an amusing image of the blood draining from the officer I was talking to, who was saying, "Do you know what that's going to do about our redeployment timetable?" And I was able to say, "I don't care."
We have 5 minutes for questions, so if there's questions in the room, there are 2 mics. Raise your hand, and please make sure there are questions, not statements. Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Professor Stone. I really appreciated your honesty about the situation of iconoclasm and the fact that, of course, we have a history ourselves of such things. And my question is about, there's a lot of focus right now about Daesh and the iconoclasm that's occurring in the Middle East, but there's a great deal of iconoclasm that's going on elsewhere in the Middle East that is completely turned a blind eye to. Yep. And I'm thinking specifically about Saudi Arabia, for example. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about what we could be doing for these kind of more ignored situations of iconoclasm.
I mean, I completely agree with you, and it's iconoclasm not only in the Middle East. It's you know, almost across the world. It's a global issue, and much of that is ignored. And the focus at the moment is on Daesh, etc., because it's something that is topical, is newsworthy, if that's the right term. It makes good news. I have no idea the number of times I've seen on the news temples being blown up at Palmyra. You know, one way that we might have avoided some of the continuing destruction was to have almost a news blackout of it, because one of the reasons that Daesh do the damage is to get publicity and to provide it with propaganda and to use it as a recruitment tool and to use it as a gesture to the rest of the world. And it really is the rest of the world. It's not just the West. It is the rest of the world who are appalled by what they're doing.
But again, sorry for interrupting,
Yeah.
Peter, but again I come back to my information thing, and communication, because just adding facts is not enough. I think it needs the right cooperation, and we still don't talk enough, I mean, as I said before, among museums, but also not with help organizations. And if you think about environmental issues, I don't think that there is a strong cooperation of museums around the world and environmental groups. That's the other problem. So I think it's just ISIS or Daesh that helps us to understand what we missed before. And I think that should be the next part of the strategy, to find the right people working together.
One more question? Yeah.
Hello, Maysa Fatouh from Tandem Works. It's along the lines of this question, but and without sounding like I'm provoking a debate about the necessity of saving cultural property or cultural heritage, it obviously is. But I was wondering, what are the steps taken by UNESCO or the public institutions to push through cultural policy that supports intangible and immaterial art forms without it being celebrated as a festival, but rather as something that's embedded as a resistance against the assumed notion that culture can vanish through the looting of objects and against the market?
I didn't really get it.
Okay, I think I understood some of what you were asking. I mean, UNESCO obviously have the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention and the such, and you use two different words, as I have done, cultural property and cultural heritage. And those different words are used in a way unhelpfully by UNESCO in different conventions. So the 1954 convention is about the protection of cultural property. 1972 convention is about the protection of the world's cultural and natural heritage. Those two are different. What I try and do is make a distinction between cultural property, which are bricks and mortars, tangible things, and culture, and that is the responsibility of sort of Blue Shield, and cultural heritage, which is more intangible and is held within people and is therefore, in many ways, the responsibility of the Red Cross. And UNESCO, in a way, almost straddles the two and should be trying to bring the two together. I was going to say the problem that UNESCO face is that they are an underfunded, overstretched organization with almost no capability. And so it's very difficult for them to have an on-the-ground immediate impact.
And
Wouldn't it be worth to say a few words about the Red Cross? Because I think that's one of those organizations that try to help, but we don't know enough and there's not enough support.
Yeah. I mean, the Red Cross have a responsibility, especially under the 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, on the protection of cultural property. But they are very reluctant to take the lead on it, I think, and I don't know if there's anybody from the Red Cross here. And my understanding of the reason for that is that they don't want to muddle the distinction between their primary role, quite rightly, of protecting people, and what is in their mind, very secondary role of protecting objects. And that's absolutely correct. And nobody from my side, nobody from the Blue Shield would say that we should put the protection of objects before the protection of people. But I would say that it comes a very close second. An individual without a memory is a dysfunctional individual. A community or a society without a memory, and that memory is encapsulated in its cultural heritage and its cultural property, can very quickly become a dysfunctional community or society. And if once you get to that stage, then you've got the breeding ground for dissatisfaction, for urban unrest, rural unrest, and future conflict. So absolutely people first. Red Cross should lead on all of that. objects and things actually a very close second, because without those, that's what makes us different. That's what actually makes us human. And that cultural heritage, that cultural property, is the distincting fact of human beings. And if we don't keep that very close to protecting humans, then you've got a problem.
On that note, let's all remember to retain our memories. And thank you for coming, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.